I'm Marti Hearst. I'm very pleased to be a part of this presentation today. Thank you for coming to my talk. And I'm going to be talking about the relationship between search, summarization, and sense-making. So there have been huge advances in natural language processing over the last 5 to 10 years. It's really quite stunning what has happened in that field. But there's been less obvious advances in search user interfaces. And what I'd like to talk about today is how can these advances in natural language processing be applied to search, and in particular to sense-making interfaces. So what is sense-making? Well, we can think of it as being a large process which consists of two major parts that have to do generally with information-intensive activities, where one part of sense-making is search and retrieval, and the other part is analysis and synthesis of information. And these two processes are intertwined, and that intertwining is called sense-making. So what we're really interested in is user interfaces that integrate search and retrieval processes with analysis, reading, and other aspects of making sense of information. So I'll be talking about two sense-making interfaces that use natural language processing in this talk, the Scholarify system and the Newslet system, both of which come out of our lab. So first I'll talk about Scholarify, which is an augmented reader for scientific papers. And this is a big collaborative project between UC Berkeley, Allen Institute for AI, and University of Washington, and supported in large part by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. So the motivation is the following. Have you ever struggled to keep track of notation or acronyms when reading a scientific paper? So for example, say you have a formula like this. Do you ever look at these values and wonder something like, what does that Y stand for again? What we want to do is make it easier to keep track of this sort of information when reading complex information. Here's another example. Say you're looking at a table at the end of the paper and you can't quite remember what does D and M stand for when comparing these different systems. Again, wouldn't it be great if a system would help you recall these things? So I'm going to show a demo of our system, and then I'll talk about the role of NLP in this.
In this talk, I introduce Scholarify, an augmented reading interface that helps people read scientific papers by revealing definitions of technical terms and symbols right where readers most need them. The interface has extremely strong usability results, reducing the effort needed to answer questions about a paper. In a lab study, all participants reported they would use its core features frequently in future reading tools. The design of Scholarify is motivated by the fact that, despite the importance of papers to scientific progress, they can be difficult to read. Comprehension is often hindered when the information a reader needs to understand a passage resides somewhere else, in another section or another paper. One problem is the abundance of abbreviations, mathematical symbols, and new terms defined within a paper for use only within that paper. These are called nonce words. Unlike standard scientific terminology, which an expert in the field is expected to learn and memorize, nonce words are like temporary variables in a programming language. They are defined for use only in the paper, and can impose a memory burden for the reader to learn. They are often cryptic. It can be hard to infer a nonce word's meaning from context, and a paper can contain hundreds of them densely packed together. How can interfaces show definitions of nonce words to readers when and where they need them the most? We designed Scholarify, an augmented reading interface that surfaces just-in-time, position-sensitive definitions of nonce words, given a set of definitions that has been extracted from the text. At its most basic, Scholarify provides standard interactive hypertext affordances. Interactive terms are shown with subtle underlines to convey their interactivity without distracting from reading. Terms can be clicked to open compact tooltips containing definitions. Atop this basic interactivity, Scholarify provides 5 unique interface components to augment the reading experience. First, it improves on standard affordances for selecting terms to better accommodate definitions of mathematical notation. Any symbol can be selected by just clicking on it. Any sub-symbol can be selected by clicking again. Second, it shows compact definitions of terms in tooltips. These definitions are position sensitive. That is, if the term has been defined differently in multiple passages, the most recent definition of that term is shown. Links accompany the definition, which take a reader to the definitions in context. And if a reader wants more information about the term, they can open a sidebar of all definitions defining formulas or usages of the term. The third innovation is called declutter. When a reader selects a term, Scholarify eliminates visual clutter to help readers scan the paper for usages. It does this by highlighting segments of text that contain matches and fading out the unmatched sentences. The fourth innovation is equation diagrams. When the reader selects a display equation, Scholarify diagrams the equation, showing the definitions for all symbols at once, where labels are automatically affixed to each symbol and subsymbol in the equation. The final innovation is an automatically generated glossary of unique terms and symbols, pre-appended to the start of the paper. This priming glossary can help prepare the reader for nonce words that appear in the paper.
So, you've seen this system, and it has to make use of natural language processing in order to achieve the goals that we expressed in that demonstration. So, for example, we need novel definition recognition algorithms to make it possible to show the equation diagram illustrations. So we have developed some, and we have a system called HEDX, which achieved state-of-the-art in recognition of definitions in scientific text. But even more importantly, it did in-depth error analysis. What goes wrong when you try to even identify what a definition is, let alone automatically recognize it in a scientific text? Here's an example of just one sentence from a scientific text, which has quite a few definitions in it. So in a given equation, S to the task are softmax normalized weights, and the scalar parameter gamma to the task allows the task model to scale the entire vector, where the underlined terms are definitions, and with the dotted lines are definitions, and the solid lines are the terms. But even here we see gamma task is defined by the term scalar parameter. It's really complicated to figure out what a definition should be and what its span is, and the syntax of the documents is quite complex as well. Here's another example. We found that we have to handle very complex cases of coordination for this problem. So if we look at a sentence like this, where we want to know what are the definitions of symbols like V sub W and U sub W, it gets really complicated. Because here we see V sub W in R of D and U sub W in R of D denote the vectors of word W in matrices V and U respectively. So we have to pull out the mapping from V sub W to word W and V, and U sub W to word W and U, and pull out these separate definitions. So when you look in great detail at a problem like definitions in scientific text, you see it's far more complicated than standard information extraction tasks. And so it's quite a challenge to do this at a very high precision and very high recall that's necessary for an application like Scholarify. The second application I'd like to talk about is the NewsLens project, and this is led primarily by Philippe Lebon, a recently graduated PhD student from UC Berkeley, and some researchers and collaborators from Microsoft Research, as well as Bloomberg, Amazon, and we were also supported by NVIDIA. So the motivation here is to provide an interface to news that inspires deeper engagement. We learned that especially young people tend to only have a very superficial exposure to news, say just reading the headlines. How can we get people to engage more deeply with high quality, accurate news? So our approach was to analyze millions of news articles and automatically extract what we call stories, as well as timelines and entities, and then build user interfaces from these that help make the news more engaging and more accessible. And we developed significant research in both summarization and simplification, as well as entity recognition and headline grouping, and a very highly valuable data set for NLP and novel user interfaces for news. So as I said, our goal was to get casual news readers to engage more in depth. Our hypothesis was that asking questions will increase engagement. So we developed a chatbot for the news. We call the NewsLens chatbot. What we did was we broke news up into stories automatically, as I said, and each is placed in a separate chat room. Then users can read through a timeline of within the story and explore recommended questions and see the answers for those questions, as well as ask their own questions. And this was displayed in a demo paper at ACL. So I'm going to show you a demo, but I want to walk you through it before I run the live demo, before I run the video demo. So as I said, news is organized into stories, and we put each story into a chat room. So this could be a story about the British royal family, the Democratic election, the impeachment inquiry, and so on. This can also encompass very long time spans. So the Boeing 737 MAX plane crash encompasses years, and our automatic story recognizer can capture that year-long span of stories. Then once you choose a story and go into the chat room, then there's a timeline of events, and each event has different sources. So here we see a source from The Guardian, as well as a source from Reuters, and each event is composed of multiple sources. Questions are then recommended to the reader. So for example, the story about the Boeing crash, the Boeing problems, there's a question about the suggested who replaced Dennis Muhlenberg as CEO of Boeing, and the answer is David Calhoun, which is extracted from one of the articles. There's other questions suggested as well. How long would it take to get the plane flying? How much trouble did CEO Dennis Muhlenberg have? Information is gathered from the news articles as well as Wikipedia sources. The reader can also ask their own questions, such as what caused the crashes, as shown here. An extractive Q&A system tries to find a likely answer. So now I'm going to show you the demo in action.
In the chatbot, the news is organized into chat rooms. Let's look at the Boeing 737 story. Each room is initialized with a timeline. The user can click on recommended questions to navigate the story. For example, who replaced the CEO of Boeing? We use a Q&A model to answer the question. Users can also type their own questions. We keep track of the conversation state to recommend unanswered questions.
All right, so as I said, the goal was to get casual news readers to engage more in depth. We did a usability study, and we found that when the chatbot recommends questions, newsreaders tend to have longer conversations than if we do not recommend questions. We've done some more recent work with an audio version of this chatbot, a podcast version, that finds participants prefer a news podcast with questions and answers over one that has stories read straight through. So we had to develop a lot of different natural language processing methods to make something like Newsled's chatbot work. One thing we had to do was leverage question answering to keep track of the conversation state. So what's the issue here? Well, in a standard state-of-the-art NLP system, a dialogue system, the information will be repeated quite a bit, so that there might be suggested, since October in Australia, fires scorched more than 10.3 million hectares. If the user asks, what else should I know? The system will tend to repeat the same information, again, saying 10 million hectares were burned. So there's a question about how do you get rid of this repetition. So we developed an algorithm, and I'm going to walk through it really quickly here, where we start with all of the paragraphs in a story, say a story about fires in Australia. Then we use a standard question generator to generate questions, multiple questions from each paragraph, who, what, where, when, why sorts of questions. Now we have a lot of paragraphs and a lot of questions. We use the system to see which paragraphs answer which questions. So we go in reverse and see which questions can be answered by which paragraphs. And we consider two paragraphs to be redundant if they cover the same questions. So as content is given to the user, we keep track of which of the questions are answerable. So if we show this paragraph, we see which questions can be answered by it, and we suggest those questions. But then if we show a paragraph, we want to eliminate paragraphs that are redundant because they cover the same questions. And so that's how we keep track of state in a novel way. We also do some automatic summarization in this tool. So we've developed a method for generating abstractive summaries in an unsupervised manner. So we developed an algorithm called the summary loop, published in ACL 2020. The goal is summaries that do not require training examples to be developed, that are highly abstractive, that have configurable lengths, so we could say they're 10 words or they're 20 words long, and they cover the key content of the original article, which is really important for news. And we've developed a novel reinforcement learning algorithm using a fill-in-the-blank with motivated choices that produces balanced coverage and fluency, and uses special techniques to make sure that the reinforcement learning algorithm doesn't degenerate. And it produced the best unsupervised results at the time for summarization and rivaled the supervised results. So what's abstractive summarization? The idea is if you have a news article like this, extractive summarization just pulls the sentences out and tries to arrange them in a meaningful way. By contrast, abstractive summarization pulls out some words from the document, rearranges them, and fills in missing words, trying to make a coherent whole that's much shorter than the original, but still reflects the key content. What makes a good summary? In our definition, a summary is a brief, fluent text that covers the main points of an original document. So this is the architecture of our algorithm, where we take as input target length and the original document, and we produce the first round a very simple summary. But then we use a masking procedure on the original document, and we compute how much does the generated summary cover the words in the original document. Can it fill in the blanks that were masked out? The coverage model is a fine-tuned BERT where we compare the summary and the masked document, and we see how many of the masked words are included in the summary, and we penalize the algorithm if some of them are missing. We also have a fluency score, and we basically combine the coverage score and the fluency score and feed that into the reinforcement learning algorithm, which we optimize with a novel version of SCST, a reinforcement learning optimization procedure. And this loops around until we find a stopping state. The last NLP method I'll briefly touch on is the goal is to simplify complex news text. So we call this algorithm the Keep It Simple algorithm, and this was done with colleagues at Microsoft Research. And the objective is that the generated text should be simpler than the original. And our method is that we use the summary loop algorithm, but modify it. We again are doing unsupervised simplification. And we have a novel way to compute simplicity or simplification, which is to compute a grade level drop from the original document to the generated one. We can feed that computation as a metric into the reinforcement learning algorithm. And that we also have a special idea, which is words added into the generated text should be more common than words removed from the original text. And that's how we can also be sure the reinforcement learning algorithm is moving in the right direction. Results are state-of-the-art, outperforming even supervised methods. We also use a novel human evaluation using simplification to answer questions. So what we did was we had the original article and a hand-generated simplification article and some other approaches as well as ours, to Keep It Simple one. And we had people answer questions about the content of that article, and compared how well they did with the original article as well as the summaries, as well as the simplified versions of the articles. And the idea being that hopefully people could answer all of the questions correctly and could answer them more quickly in the simplified version. And we found a lot of positive results that way with our system. Here's an example of a difference between an original and a simplified document. So the grade 11 version has each summer, libraries in St. Louis, Missouri host many types of free camps. Camp dreams seem far-fetched given the global coronavirus pandemic. This was changed to in the summer months, St. Louis has many free classes for kids. In 2020, camp dreams again seem far-fetched given the crisis that didn't stop St. Louis libraries. So there's enough changes to make it a little simpler but retain the content. So in conclusion, NLP is making huge strides. It's amazing that we can do this sort of summarization, simplification today. It's not error-free, but it's making huge progress. This is enabling new types of user interfaces for understanding complex information to make people more efficient and effective, and hopefully make reading and working with information more enjoyable as well. And we introduced two examples, Scholarify, which is hopefully making scientific documents more understandable, and NewsLens, which is helping people get a deeper understanding of news. Thank you very much for your attention.